Hi, it's Renee with Reset with Renee. I'm so glad you're here with me. On this episode, we're going to talk a little bit more about CPTSD, or complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And I want to start with my opinion on why I think it's such a big deal. I really believe that complex trauma is more pervasive, more common, much more of an epidemic than people realize. And so I'm going to explain why, because I know that's a pretty big statement. But CPTSD, or complex trauma, is not currently a diagnosis in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that mental health providers and other folks use to label, process for billing, do all the things to help provide services. So I'm not a big fan of the DSM, just to be clear, but I wanted you all to understand that what I'm talking about doesn't exist in black and white within that manual, and therefore it's not covered by insurance. And so what we do have currently are a lot of people walking around with different mental health diagnoses and also some medical diagnoses that all kind of fall under this umbrella of complex trauma. So how I arrived at this statement. With complex trauma, we're looking at a couple of big pieces. And I've had some folks argue with me about this, and everyone is entitled to their own opinion and experience for sure. But this is where I'm coming from personally, professionally, having really invested time into this specialty niche. And so all of us have what we call ancestors or lineage. And so we inherit gifts from our ancestors, from our lineage, all of our lines, our biological family lines. And along with the gifts, we also inherit burdens. And so it can often be an inheritance of hurt, a frequency of fear. Oftentimes I hear it like when I do my own lineage healing, or I'm working with a client, it sounds like this really intense, big fear that seems larger and more out of context to what the trigger is the person's speaking about. And then, so we have the inheritance of fear. That's one. The frequency, inheritance of hurt. Two, frequency of fear. Three, shadowy protective parts. So those are like the coping skills we've seen modeled, the coping skills that we carry out as part of our family programming, as part of the cultural programming. And so this is all stuff that we're running that we didn't even choose. It was just passed on to us. The good stuff with the gifts, and the not so great stuff with the inheritance of hurt and the frequency of fear, and how we cope with that. So that's just your lineage. So then you have what's happened to you during your lifetime. So most folks that I work with have what's called developmental trauma. Developmental means how we're supposed to develop normally, quote unquote, throughout the lifetime. And for infants, for young children, for adolescents, young adults, there's things that need to happen and be taught. And there's protection that needs to be had during critical points of that person's development. So if someone didn't receive the skills, the support, the scaffolding that they needed, their needs weren't met, that's going to be a hurt. And if they weren't protected, if they were harmed in addition to not having their needs met, then that's another level of wounding that has happened. And most often developmental trauma happens within a relational context with primary caregivers, later in school with people in the education system, or it could be like any program you're part of, like sports or dance, church, any system where people have authority and positions of power, and they're there to teach and guide and protect you, but fail to do so, or create harm. So you can develop your own hurt, your own fear, your own protective instincts from your human experience. So you've got the human experience and the lineage, and then we throw in the other piece that happens in our human lifetime. It's the wounding we get from the collective, and it's really difficult to avoid that unless perhaps you have more privilege than someone else. So in social work, we talk about intersectionality, meaning people who carry multiple differences that assign them less power than those who are in a position to have more power. So think of things like race, gender, sexual orientation, other lifestyle differences. I talk about like neurodiversity or neurocomplexity that can create differences, and all these things create a struggle for resources, legitimacy. They feel othered, they've been harmed in specific ways by people that are in the majority and don't have those differences. And so there's collective wounds that we all carry. So as you can see, you can't control what you inherit. A lot of us have inherited some stuff. And then, when we're young, we can't control our environment. We can't control the adults in our world. And then when we're launched into the world, the collective's bigger entity than any one of us. That's what a collective is. So that's what happens. And so a lot of folks are walking around carrying the wounding and the protective coping strategies from all of the things that I've named. And what that looks like in your average Jane or Joe who's not aware or conscious to this yet is someone who believes in the hierarchy of things, people who are in a struggle with power. So they either feel victimized and always on the receiving end of hurt and harm, or they're the one that's like trying to dominate and control so that they're the ones with the power and they're not the one feeling vulnerable. There's separation and otherness. So someone's a winner, someone's a loser, someone's in, someone's out. And with that, there's comparison. And then there's blame, shame, and judgment. So it's a hot mess. And a lot of my clients that I work with come from family systems where these behaviors are the norm. And so that's what they grew up in. It's like this marinade of all of these coping behaviors to cover the fear, to cover the hurt, to cover the shame. And that's not what we want to create. And so I have a personal mission of doing my own complex trauma, CPTSD recovery. I do consider myself a cycle breaker. I didn't ask for that. I didn't ask for CPTSD. Nobody asked for it. We don't want it. It's not fair. But yet, if you can recover your CPTSD, that is like the Olympics of mental health. If you can do that, you really emerge as a extraordinary person who's here to help other people on their healing, growth, and leadership journey. So help people individually, help groups, help shift what happens in the collective. It starts with one person. And so that's the invitation for anyone who works with me. It's like, hey, do you want to be the one person? I mean, we can alleviate symptoms, and that's good. Want that for you. And considering that you aren't solo, you have relationships, you have systems you interact with, like, let's help level it up for everybody. So healing from CPTSD is its own challenge. And then when you really answer the call to cycle break, that's like taking it to a whole nother level. And that process takes some time. And so what I'd like to see for the collective is people working on an individual level to clear out the trauma, the lineage that they inherited, that hurt, that fear, that shame, and then what they've encountered in their human lifetime that's been burdensome. And so clear that out, help restore yourself to a place of wholeness. And then from that place to be able to model what it looks like to be embodied in health, in growth, and leadership. And then really help people around you do the same, face fear, face power struggles. And to do that, you need to reclaim your seat of personal power. You need to be in relationships with people where there's an equal exchange of power, or you make decisions based on knowing what your value is or isn't. You're looking for more alignment. We're not calling people out, we're calling in what we want to create. So it really shifts the way that people show up in their families, at work, in their communities. So that's what I'm after. And bear with me while I pull up something on my other computer, but I've been writing some blog articles, and one of those recently landed on my website, www.resetwithrenee.com. If you go over to the blog, there's one there now, and it says Understanding Complex PTSD, so CPTSD. And how is it different from PTSD? So I start off talking about that. And I think that that is a question I get often. You know, people seem to understand what PTSD is, like an event of war, a major car accident, natural disaster, you know, things that we can't predict that happen, that shock us and create those trauma effects in us that then trauma healing helps to process through to completion. And so folks who have CPTSD often have a lifetime of PTSD events, and they've just jumped from one challenge, one trauma to the next, not having time, support, energy, or resources to really complete that undercompleted trauma response. And so it becomes very layered and complex over time. New things touch old triggers, and it gets really, really messy inside. And sometimes it looks messy on the outside. So folks with CPTSD have that developmental trauma that I mentioned earlier, and that developmental trauma leaves them more susceptible or vulnerable then to secondary trauma, especially in adulthood with their relationships, because they don't have the blueprint. They don't know the core lessons. They don't know how to discern and protect themselves, as well as folks who didn't have developmental trauma. So they have some real challenges in navigating adulthood sometimes. And so what I want to talk about are some of the common characteristics that I see in fellow CPTSD survivors. Thanks, I had to take a drink. Mm-hmm. So these are things that you can think about for yourself, think about for your children, consider for your parents, people that you work with, like not to assess them or judge them or tell them that they need to get on a healing journey, but it's just my hope of this podcast episode is to build more awareness. And so the first is the relational betrayal trauma. Like I mentioned, happens often in developmental stages when you're, when you're young. And then when you go out into the world to have friendships, romantic relationships, work relationships, if you're not primed to know how to discern and filter and protect yourself, you're more likely to be used, to get clogged, to be victimized. And so it tends to reharm and re-wound and deepen the wounds and protection that was already there. And so if you're wondering if you have developmental trauma, a helpful test that can help you decide is the ACE test, the Adverse Childhood Events test. I have a link in the blog, or you can Google that. And it by no means has all of the quote unquote events that I would consider the kinds of things that contribute to developmental trauma, but it has like some main ones. So generally, the higher your ACE score, the more that you had exposure to trauma, the more likely you're carrying some trauma responses inside your system. And that's important. I mention that because part of developmental trauma oftentimes is that it's so invisible. So people that have had like overt abuse of any kind, like especially physical or sexual, something that you can look back on or someone can observe it happening to you, like that is less invisible at times. although sexual trauma has its own nuanced piece, so I don't want to not give enough legitimacy to that. But so many of the folks that I speak with have more of the emotional neglect kind of wounds, invisible wounds. And so what that could sound like is, yes, I was provided for, I had a roof over my head, I was fed. Okay, maybe we didn't have a lot of money, but I had, my basic needs met. But dad was angry, mom was shut down. I mean, whatever it was where your caregivers weren't present enough, they weren't attuned enough, they weren't engaged enough to help you developmentally meet your needs and help you navigate life's challenges at an early age, that creates those invisible wounds. And what that will look like inside is someone who is like self-doubting. They're often conflicted. They feel guilt a lot of the time. They feel fear a lot of the time. They have anxiety, and it's all like mixed in together. So many people come to work with me and they're like, I'm just so anxious. I'm like, okay, is it anxiety or is it, what's the anxiety representing? Let's dig a little deeper. So that's a little bit about that. And then as people age, across the developmental lifespan, after a certain period of time, they start to get really challenged physically, energetically, and medically. So quite a few folks come to me at the recommendation, thank you docs who do this, of their doctor, because they're having multiple medical issues. And the doctor can see that if their stress doesn't get under control, I'm air quoting that they're going to continue to have physical issues and major medical issues. And so when people have that kind of wake up call, it's like, I have got to learn how to put myself first. I've got to figure out ways to deal with the people, places, and things that are in my environment that are stressful. And so that's how a lot of folks will come to work with me. And so when you have a high ACE score, when you've had developmental trauma, you also tend to have more inflammation in your system, which shows up as like autoimmune and other conditions. So and a lot of folks I talk to have experienced medical trauma. They've experienced gaslighting from the medical community, even well-intentioned folks in the medical community and in the mental health community too. So there's a lot of like lack of understanding about how interconnected the mental and the physical is, especially for CPTSD survivors. Okay, and then the other piece that's really, really common for most people, but is punctuated with CPTSD, is coping behaviors. These are folks who are really walking around in the nervous system responses, which isn't bad because that's what your nervous system is there to protect you. It's like fight, flight, freeze, fawn, and friend. It's like, what do I need to do to make it feel safe? What do I need to do to make myself okay? What do I need to do to make this less scary right now? Like that's their orientation to everything. And that's not a place of growth. That's a place of like contraction and suffering and fear. I don't want that for you or your loved ones. And so when we get locked into the habit of our coping behaviors, we lock away our hurting parts, and we become disconnected from ourselves. Like the spirit of who we are, our heart gets armored up. We get disconnected in our relationships. And it's a ripple effect, not a good one. The kind that I'd like to reverse for a lot of people. So you have the coping behaviors, you have the self-doubt, the confusion, the anxiety, the overwhelm. You've got big energy. And so when in present day, something happens to you that activates or quote unquote triggers an emotion or energy, oftentimes it's bigger than what you would expect if you were an outsider looking in. But internally, that feeling may be super familiar because it's familiar with what you've experienced in the past many times, and you've really tried to like not feel that again. And so most people tend to stuff it down and avoid it. And so it's like when it finally gets to come up, it's not going to come up like in a little dribble. It's going to come up in a big fountain. And then it's like, oh, I don't want to have that. I really got to stuff it down. I really got to tuck it away. And so you've got a cycle going. So recovery is about like starting to dip into the feeling. We call that titration and come back to a place of safety. And so that's often a starting point for CPTSD recovery. So what's like the big energy and big emotions? Fear is a big one. Like I said, it's all around us. We inherited it, and now we have our own. Shame. So much of what's passed down, what's generated is the cover up for shame. If I don't feel like I'm good enough as a person, I'm going to put on some kind of act so that I look okay and I act okay and I'm more accepted by other people, or I get more of what I want and less of what I don't want. So it just really contributes to that disconnection. I mentioned anxiety. Depression is another one. I mean, people go to a place of what's called dorsal vagal shutdown. And that is where they feel like they're helpless, they're powerless, they're in a state of energetic and physical collapse. Like it's like a grief on steroids. And it scares people. They feel like they're losing it. They can't function at their normal capacity. It's like they need major rest before they can start dialing up their capacity again. So depression and then anger. There's a lot of, folks with CPTSD when they're not able to connect with a recovery resource, they are carrying around a lot of anger, understandably so, but that can morph into bitterness and like some really crunchy, critical energy that creates distance. So even though they want to have connections and relationships and feel better, it's like the energy that they're putting out is so off-putting, it creates more separation for them. So understanding that when you carry big energy and big emotions, there's probably a reason for something to be so big, so loud, so intense. And usually it has to do with how much it's been avoided. So that's one of the paradoxes, I believe, about recovery. Oftentimes folks with CPTSD, because they have experienced abuse, they have had people perpetuate harm from a position of power, they've actually internalized the voice, the words, the tone of that critical or abusive person. And so it's really, really interesting to me how the inner critic will show up in its different forms, flavors, and intensities. A lot of the female clients I work with in general, really, men though too, they all struggle with like people pleasing, that's that fawning, performing, like I must energy, like survival energy, producing, so like workaholic kind of stuff, like where you can't sit down and be still and relax and really receive and just be, um, peacekeeping, placating, just trying to reduce conflict at all costs. And so when we do those kinds of things, creates disconnection and it creates burnout. So there's lots of way the inner critic can show up. It can be like a taskmaster. It can have the sound of like your parents' voice or a coach, whoever. So that's something to be paying attention for. And then the other piece that I like to talk about is the presence of some kind of neurodiversity or neurocomplexity. There's a lot of things that fall under the umbrella of that right now. So like folks who have diagnosed or undiagnosed ADD, ADHD, autism, a combo. Maybe they were gifted, twice exceptional. So these are folks who tend to have areas where they are really like off the charts developed in a certain area. And then there's going to be some places where they have a harder time. There's more of a deficit. There's more of a difference. And so these folks have had relational trauma just by the very fact that they're wired differently. And if it's not accepted by the norm, then they're othered. And so they have a lot of beliefs and burdens. And I personally relate to that. So it's something I like to be clear that I'm available to talk to you about that. Power struggles would be the other thing. So because there's such a power struggle in the collective, the hierarchy, the abuse of power, Then you see it in relationships with like what we call a flip flop or a power struggle or the victim triangle. It's like there's someone who feels helpless, powerless, and legitimately victimized. And then there's someone who's doing the power over, the perpetuating, they're the bigger force or abusive, whatever terminology you want to put to it. It's like if you're in the victim role or you're the one who's abusing power, both of you are victims. Neither one of you are in your personal power, and that's something that needs to be addressed for both people, albeit in different ways. And so what'll happen for many survivors is, like, a lot of them will go along to get along, try to keep peace, bond, people please, but then they'll get so dang tired of being victimized that a part of them will then be like, never again. I'm going to get control of this. And they start leading with more of an angry, I'm going to power over, I'm going to destroy, I won't do this anymore. Here's my hard boundary, like doing everything they can to protect themselves from being victimized again. So sometimes you do both. So it's really our relationship to power and our relationship to our personal power that we want to pay attention to. Okay, getting close to the end of this list on the blog, but relationship struggles, gosh, like if you have CPTSD, you're going to have attachment wounds. The people in your life who were supposed to be there for you weren't enough. People have left you, people have betrayed you. And so then you go on and you form relationships later in life, and you don't always have like the best quote unquote antenna. I've heard that metaphor before. It's like you don't pick up on the thing you're supposed to pick up. So a lot of folks have abandonment wounds. I've seen this in both genders, a mother wound, a father wound, whatever. And it's like they keep going for people who are not available, and thus triggering that abandonment wound. They self-abandon to keep the attachment relationship. They want to have an attachment, but when it causes them to abandon themselves, they're hurt again. So that's something I see a lot of survivors struggle with. I know I for sure have myself. In the past, it's like when you haven't felt loved enough, when you haven't felt cherished enough, it's like you haven't eaten in decades. And then someone comes along and offers you some attention. Or they seem like they want a relationship, but they really don't. It's like, well, someone just brought you a bunch load of candy, and although it's not really healthy for you, by God, you've been starving for decades, you're here for it. You're going to take it. And so until that need for authenticity and the need for attachment can be honored and dealt with at the same time, a lot of people repeat unhealthy relationships. I've been there. No shame, no shame or judgment. I'm just saying that that's another piece that adds to the whole CPTSD thing. And then the other piece I don't want to forget is this feeling of being behind in life. So this happens like, again, with folks who are like my generation, Gen X, maybe a little younger, maybe a little bit older. It's like we thought we'd be further ahead. Like on one hand, we're glad to have made it. Like it took a lot to get us here. And yet, had we not been in survival mode for as long as we had and all the ways that we had, the failed relationships, the failed, all the things that went wrong on top of all the things that went wrong that we didn't have control over. It's like, my God, so much wasted time, so much wasted money, so much wasted everything. And when you're not manifesting what you think you should at a certain point in life, it hurts. It requires a lot of like understanding, self-forgiveness, mercy, compassion, and like that, and a lot of begin again energy. Like you can recover from your CPTSD. You can have a take two. It's not too late. And that's a real hard message to absorb when you're early on in a recovery journey. I know. So if you feel behind, you're not alone in that at all. And so this is why I talk about CPTSD, as I mentioned at the beginning. I want there to be a ripple effect. Treatment of CPTSD has not been comprehensive, in my opinion. I mean, if we don't have a label for it, it's not being researched. Okay. It's not being reimbursed for in terms of mental health payments or even, physical health for that matter. So for complex trauma, we need intervention that's multifaceted, that is really broad enough that people can find their kind of medicine within an overall toolbox or umbrella, if you will, of options available to them. So, so if any of this is like ringing true, if it's resonating, it's hitting close to home, then consider that you might be one of those people who's ready to answer the call of CPTSD recovery, maybe even cycle breaking. Most people I speak with, they want to have a better relationship with their partner. They want to have a better relationship with their children. They want to have a better relationship with their parents. And if they can't have a better one, they like to have a less stressful one. And so the reality is, I've heard my mentors say, like, in guiding CPTSD recovery, as you begin to make changes internally, not everyone's going to calibrate to that. Not everyone's going to come with you. Some people are going to piece out. And so you need to be prepared for that when you embark on a recovery journey. Things are going to change outside of what's happening inside. And we want that to happen, but it can be surprising. It can be hard. It can be shocking. It can be sad when you lose people, places, and things that have been important to you when you embrace healing, recovery, and growth, and they aren't willing or aren't able to join you. So that's often a block for people looking to get into recovery. It's because they intuitively know, if I do this, it means I have to deal with this. That I can share with you, there's been times in my life where I've known I need to exit this situation. I need to stop this behavior. I need to stop this relationship, whatever it was. And at the time, it's like, it's meeting more needs than if I didn't have this relationship. There'd be even more needs not being met. And so there needs to be like a proportionality of resourcing for you internally and externally in order for you to have the kind of oomph to get through, to get up to that, to get through it, and to get on the other side, which is entirely possible. And then the last thing I'll say, I put a link in the blog article. You may have heard of the book, The Body Keeps the Score. It's an interesting read. The edition I had was published in 2014, but it's by Bessel van der Kolk. He's a physician that talks about trauma. And in chapter 10, he did a really nice job talking about how long those of us in the trauma field have known that complex trauma exists, and how it is still not being recognized or identified. And my personal opinion is, if that were to happen on a systemic level, that means so many things would have to change hierarchically, with power, with payment. And it's not right. It's not fair, but it is what is. So, so if you're interested about like the history of that, check it out. And if you're a person like me, like I'm a Gen Xer, I'm a trained therapist, I'm a therapist turned coach. I've been in the mental health field for 24 years. I got into the field because of my own family wanting to do better. And I think about how much work I've done, which is often something people say to me when they start working with me. I've done so much work. I've seen so many therapists. I've already worked on that. I said the same thing. And you work on it to a certain level until you're brought to a point in your life developmentally with resources, or you find another person, another guide, another therapist, coach, facilitator who has something new to bring to the table, and it like takes you to a next level. So no shame if it's taken you a long time, like decades to get there. And also, it's not your fault if you haven't recovered, because our field has not been, a lot of folks are trauma informed and actively working to be trauma informed to meet you where you are. And a lot of folks are just not even aware of their own trauma. So how are they going to help you with yours? So anyway, it's not too late. And if you're not Gen X and you're younger generation, I love working with you all because, man, if some of my mistakes and lessons, hard won, whew, if I can spare you that and you're open, I'd love to let you know, like, do this, don't do that. This is how it worked out for me. This is the lesson I gained. So I am here for that if you are interested. And I just want to encourage the ripple effect. Kind of circling back to where I started, like, it takes one person to like reclaim themselves to wholeness and to begin to get in right relationship with the folks in their environment, and to begin to rumble with fear in the collective, to rumble with power struggles in the collective, and to show up in a different way. That invites and calls in a higher frequency of living, of being a human. So to me, that's what CPTSD recovery is about. It's like, hey, release the lineage burdens, release this lifetime burdens, reclaim the stuff that's been lost that is yours. Lean into your gifts, lean into your ancestors' gifts, identify your practices and processes that help you do this and stay resourced. And then from there, you can really do like some mindset work and some deepening. So there's so much to do with CPTSD recovery. I don't want to overwhelm you with that, but there's a couple different places where you can start depending on where you are and what's in front of you right now. So I want to thank you for joining me for this episode of Reset with Renee. I hope to see you back here again. My plan is, as I think I wrote about 12 blogs, and as those get published to the website, I intend to come back here and record my thoughts on them on the podcast, and then to put that also over on YouTube. So if you don't follow me already on any of those platforms, you can find me YouTube, a couple different podcasts, Spotify, Apple for one, Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. It's all Reset with Renee, and I would love to have you follow me. Come back soon, stay connected, and keep being you. Thanks for joining me.